Hello, Podsmashers of the internet, and welcome to another episode of
8-bit Podsmash, 8-bit Podsmash.
Was that your 1970s
The little
disco
Bee Gees.
8-bit Podsmash?
Yeah.
Where gaming
goes to grab a beer.
We are your hosts.
Penguin and Termite.
I am Termite.
And I'm Penguin.
And we are a weekly video game podcast, smashing together topics that you care about with video games.
We almost smashed those beer bottles together.
And we had a hard clink. It was a rough one.
Yeah, it was a good one, though. I would have laughed so hard if
that would have just shattered.
Oh
and then the
God.
audience would have heard the
scream. Yeah, it would have been awesome.
And it would have been over.
Yep.
But then we would have edited it all out and you guys wouldn't have known that. So maybe
right,
we're
I would
back.
have been down a computer or whatever, but, you know, it's cool.
We are drinking?
Yeah, we are drinking Corona Premier. Because it's only 2 carbs, and I can drink it.
I am actually going to drink one of these with Penguin, but because it is only 2 carbs and 90 calories and nothing, I am adding to it, since I'm not on a keto diet, the Great Divide Strawberry Rhubarb Sour Ale.
It sounds amazing. I'm going to have to take a sip.
It is a limited release, so I don't know what that looks like or like when it comes out, but it is July 25th, the night that we are recording, so that I know sometimes we don't like to date ourselves, but this isn't a very time-related topic night, so I'm doing it. And
I'm doing it.
the Great Divide is a brewery located in Colorado, and it's a very good brewery. Everything I've had, I know, why does Corona make you want to do that? Anyway, really good brewery, and it's actually a shout out to a friend of the show, James, whoever you want to be called, however you want to be.
Jimothy.
Sure. It's actually his favorite beer from that brewery. So I picked up a 6-pack today, and it is absolutely incredible for the late summer, really hot, sour,
I'm going to take a
puckery
sip.
strawberry.
I don't care if it knocks me out of
It will
ketosis.
probably
I'm taking a sip.
interrupt the podcast to open this and drink it. So I'm
Nice.
going to start with the Corona with Penguin Man, and then I'll move on to the Great Divide Strawberry Rhubarb.
Fantastic. All right. Well, is there anything we missed in our intro? Gaming Goes to Grab Beer, Penguin and Termite.
You can find us at 8bitpodsmash.com, which is our landing website, where you'll find links to Google Play, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, etc., etc. If we are not on a platform you want us to be, let us know, and we'll put ourselves there. You can provide feedback about our topics, our episodes, how good or bad we are, at various social media outlets. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit. We are everywhere. 80BITPOD smash.
Smash, bros. Anyways, normally we don't start with plugs. Normally we start off just talking about news and banter. So
Nintendo's amazing.
Nintendo is great.
Or
but
are they?
They had a little slip up recently. I shouldn't say slip up. I should just say they've come under the crossfire. So apparently there's a thing that people have been dealing with for a while and just started kind of popping up. People started realizing that they were all experiencing it, and it's referred to as Joy-Con drift, and it's in reference to the Nintendo Switch's Joy-Con controllers. And basically, people have been reporting that the controller will move without them touching the joystick of the left Joy-Con. Is it?
It's any.
Is
both.
it either of them? Okay, yeah. So you may not think that's not a huge deal. It can be a huge deal in certain games. You know, if basically it's putting in inputs that you're not.
With the advent of
inputting.
games like Mario Maker, where you need to make pixel-perfect runs and jumps, sometimes the Joy-Con drift will mess you up.
Yeah,
So-
and Smash Bros. Too, like where you know, Twitch reaction, very, very precisely timed moves could throw you off slightly.
And like cameras are moving, well, like, say Breath of the Wild, which we always talk about. It would not be an 80-bit Pod Smash episode without talking about Breath of the Wild. But sometimes the camera's moving in certain directions while you're trying to aim with the bow and arrow, so it can throw off your ability to play the game. I'm trying to find an
up to this
article
point,
to quote.
there was a Kotaku one that was pretty
exactly
good
where I'm
that
looking.
summarized it. So basically people just kind of all of a sudden started realizing that everyone was having this issue. Probably within the last few months or so. Nintendo had been silent about it for a while, long enough for people to submit a class action lawsuit against them. Basically,
Start to.
Basically claiming that, like, some people were claiming that it was happening to their Switches right out of the box. Some people were claiming it happened only after a few months of having a Switch. One way or another, most modern controller standards these days don't have drifting joysticks for years. And
it's more egregious because the Joy-Cons are like $70 for a set.
Yeah, $80.
They're extremely expensive.
Yeah, they're very expensive controllers, and some people consider them a luxury controller.
Yeah.
So a luxury controller, the argument is a luxury controller should not have this problem. So I guess the big news then this week is that Nintendo announced that they will be offering free repairs basically for it.
So the warranty, the way it works is if you buy the system, the Switch, the actual console, you have a warranty for a year. And you get 2 Joy-Cons with that, and those are covered for a year.
Yeah.
If you buy an additional set of Joy-Cons, it's only covered for 3 months, 90 days. Those are the warranties that are already in place. Nintendo's policy originally was to follow the regular warranty place. So if your controller was out of warranty by a day, and you had Joy-Con drifting, and you filed a complaint with Nintendo, they would charge you $40 for the repair and do the regular process.
Right.
Seemed like it was a very common issue. People were talking amongst themselves. The internet kind of grew in its way that it does. And people were finding out that through surveys, there's potentially like a 20% chance that your Joy-Cons will affect with drifting. And that became the feed to the class action lawsuit building.
Right.
And I don't remember the lawsuit or the law firm that was starting that. And then silently, Nintendo decided to make the decision to replace all Joy-Cons for free. And of course, they're not going to come out with a public statement and say, hey, we'll fix them for free.
Right.
But there was like an internal memo that got leaked. And that got out to the journalists, and so now it's public news that if your Joy-Con is suffering drift issues, you can send it in, and they will actually refund you. If you have already spent the $40, you can submit your proof.
Right, they're doing the damage control right, but the argument and the cautionary tale here is you need to design them right in the first, you know what I mean? Like, this shouldn't happen to a brand new console. I mean, Nintendo Switch has been out for 2 years now. Gosh, it's been 2
March
years,
2016.
17,
you're right. Yeah.
So 2 years.
Yep.
The Switch,
Just over
so
2
it has been out for 2 years, but still, I would consider that pretty new for a console, all things considered, and it shouldn't be happening. So
the PS4 is 6 years old.
Yeah, if Nintendo needs to spend, $4 more per Joy-Con to make those joysticks sturdier.
They've already fixed it. Like, apparently the issue with the brand new models is like they've addressed the issue.
Oh, really?
So it's mostly like early Joy-Cons and like mid Joy-Cons.
So
but
to be
apparently
fair,
new
mine
ones
has not experienced that.
I haven't either.
And I don't think you have either. Yeah,
I need to go back and check my OG ones, though. Because I haven't used those in a while. I got some new ones for Christmas, which were a favorite thing on the show earlier. Go back and check it out. But the only biggest complaint I have here about this whole situation, go Nintendo, you are amazing for addressing this. You have the best customer service ever. I totally agree. Like, out of all the video game companies out there, Nintendo is phenomenal to deal with. They're super nice. They always listen to you. And I've had them go out of their way to help me out numerous times.
Yeah.
So good on them for doing this. But the internet kind of had to create a movement and hold their feet to a fire.
Yeah, that's what
would have happened if no one complained? Right. They would have just kept on going following their standard warranty process.
That's why I can't just sit here and praise Nintendo completely for it.
Exactly.
I have to say, like, they're doing the right thing in hindsight, but they had to be pressured to do so. So, I mean,
it's another
that's another cautionary tale is like when there's evidence, when people don't just think that they're trolls on Reddit, like, you have to take your audience seriously. When they get together and put statistics together, you should get ahead of that and say, yep, you know what? Like we need to figure this out, and we need to do it fast.
This is a great example.
The damage control should have been done months ago, is what I'm saying. The damage control that's happening now should have been done in January.
Oh, sure. And other companies will probably take notice. Yep. This is a great example. We have an episode about entitled gamers that we talked about at large, about the outrage coming out of the internet and its validation and such and such. This is a positive example. The internet came out and had a whole bunch of outbreaks notifying everyone. This is also a good idea for journalists to get exposure for stuff. We talk about how Kotaku has all these articles about crunch time and all these exposés about all these various companies and developers that work conditions aren't ideal. We have a whole episode about unionization in the gaming industry and how that came about, and there's a movement there, and like all of those arguments kind of play into the larger conversation about how people are now making change in the gaming industry, and this is a positive example of Nintendo actually yielding to the feedback.
Your voice actually surprisingly matters now more than it probably ever has, which is probably a good place to be. Yeah.
Unfortunately, EA didn't fix Anthem, so here we are.
Exactly.
Fallout 76 is looking good.
I just hope that people look back on this decade and actually learn from designers, developers, manufacturers look back on the decade and actually learn from some of the mistakes that were made all around. That's what I just think that's the next step the industry needs, because there's so many examples of it. And I can even cite games that I like and I'm looking forward to that I can still say, y'all should look at this other game and see how they did it. And the best example I have of that is it's a game that's not out yet, so there's still features that can be announced. But I really want Borderlands to look at what Diablo did and
learn.
Learn exactly. And even Diablo had to look back on what decisions it made and fix them. So that's it's a very it's just kind of cool that that's happening with Nintendo now.
Yeah,
the whole event is fascinating, and if it had negatively impacted me, I might have been more irate about it, but in this case I think it's just interesting to see how the whole thing's shaken out. So I mean,
I will go back and test out my Joy-Cons and see if they still if they have drift or not.
Yeah.
And apparently this is one of the consequences of it are now people can take advantage of it.
Yeah.
For example, my left OG Joy-Con doesn't click in, so it can just come out without the button being pressed.
Yeah.
And that's annoying. So
I could get replaced,
be like, hey, my Joy-Con's busted, and I could take advantage of the system. I'm not going to do that unless there is actually
I want
drifting.
some new color.
Right. Or I just want to refresh on because I've worn mine out, or
as well.
I sat on mine accidentally. So, all those other...
Do you have to send yours in?
Yeah.
Oh, you have to send them in. Okay, fair enough.
But a lot of people have more than one set.
Right, yeah.
And so that's kind of like baby with the bathwater,
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, we can go ahead and move on to our next segment, which is
doing this podcast is our favorite thing. Doing this podcast is our favorite thing.
Favorite thing.
If there was a way to discify that, is that even a word? Discofy? 70s-ify it?
Oh yeah, we didn't talk about our topic. Whatever. It's fine. We'll get to it. Yeah. The Favorite Things is a segment of our podcast where we just try to update you with whatever our favorite thing is for the week in hopes that you might find your new favorite thing. I need time to think.
And I'm about to create your favorite thing.
Nice. Ooh, I want to take a sip of this. Sip of this.
Sip o' dis.
It's good. It's a sour. I wouldn't say it's amazing.
Really?
I've had a better sour in the last week. And by I mean I took a sip of a better sour.
There's your favorite thing.
That's my favorite thing.
Go
Yay.
for it.
All
Use
right.
it.
This is my favorite thing. My
favorite things can be as shallow as I had a good bowel movement to as sentimental and deep as I've had a meaningful conversation with my wife.
No, this is just I took a sip of a beer because, again, I couldn't drink the whole thing, but I took a sip of a limited release from Trapezium. I don't know what it's called, what its name was, but it was generally it was a blueberry sour. Apparently, they released it last year, and it took they had it up for 3 weeks. Apparently, this year they sold out in 3 days.
Woo!
So it was really
you
good.
Guys
took a sip of
jump on it.
It was so good. It was like taking a sip of alcohol Skittles. It was really good.
This is amazing.
This is good too. Yeah, it's good. I like it.
This is so good.
I would drink that whole thing for sure and enjoy it. Yeah. I don't really know enough about the flavor of rhubarb though. Have you ever had rhubarb cooked? See, I've never
rhubarb tart?
Yeah, never had it. I don't know what its flavor is.
It's a less sweet strawberry.
Oh, really?
So it's less sweet and more sour.
Yeah.
But I like that because sometimes
it
tarts
works well in a sour beer.
Yeah, it can be too sweet. Strawberries are very sweet. So rhubarb was the counter to that.
Cool. Do you have a favorite thing apart from
absolutely.
strawberry? Okay.
You can see nothing but that if you just look that way.
Oh, your TV?
So I looked on, I peruse Facebook Marketplace and OfferUp almost daily, especially now that I have a newborn and I have to rock him to sleep. And he's doing nothing but sleeping on me as he is being coerced to fall asleep so I can put him in his crib. So I'm scouring the internet, wasting time. And I discovered that someone was giving away a Sony Trinitron Wega TV, 32-inch, which is the perfect TV for retro gaming.
Nice.
As far as consumer TV products are.
Right.
It's the perfect one. It's a flat screen, but it is by no means a flat panel.
Right,
and it's very huge. It's 250 pounds. It took me and a friend, Matt, friend of the show, Co-opetition Matt. He was a guest on our show.
Friend of the show.
He helped me go get it. He let me use his Jeep. We went and grabbed it. It was ridiculously heavy, and you'll have no idea how difficult it was to get in here. You would think it'd be super easy going from a garage through one door into this room, but no, it was very hard. But it's my favorite thing. It is amazing. The picture's crisp. The quality is awesome, and it's big. 32 inches is a lot bigger than you think.
Sweet.
So, and now I play retro games on it. And it supports S-Video, which makes my Super Nintendo and N64 games look better.
Perfect.
It looks awesome. So I'm very excited about it. It's my favorite thing this week.
Cool.
Cost me nothing, by the way. It was free.
That's awesome.
Just had to go get
Even
it.
better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Free TVs.
Favorite things.
Meow, 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 meow. Oh, wait. Next segment of our podcast is DLC.
Yeah, downloadable content is the next segment of our show where we have a discussion about video games or other stuff.
A side discussion.
Yeah, it's
something
a side-
extra.
something-
A little different.
You wouldn't normally think about having this kind of conversation. It's a little bit out of the
Almost
box
a
thinking.
game or a gimmick.
A bit, you might say.
Oh, how about that?
One of 80 bits. Yeah, we have introduced this segment in so many different ways.
Yep.
It's awesome. All right. Yeah, so for DLC for the day, I'm going to do an out-of-the-box question. But since we're talking about the 70s, and one of the big things, as we will discuss, that happened in the 70s was the emergence of personal computing.
How about that?
And a big player in... One of the big players was Microsoft, which, as we know, has a console, the Xbox.
Uh-huh.
But I was thinking, let's do a hypothetical. Let's go back to the 1970s. We're going to go on our time machine and we're going to slip Steve Jobs a note saying, "Hey, you should make a video game console." And he's going to listen to that idea. So what? Then we come back to the future, get back to the present.
So we give Steve Jobs an almanac that tells him all of the results of the gaming industry and how lucrative it is.
Yeah, basically. Yeah,
and then we come back to the future.
Back to the present.
Oh.
Or back to the future.
We
back
don't
to the present.
need roads.
Yeah, we don't need roads where we're coming from. Going. Which, did that come out in the 70s? That might be perfect.
No,
Anyways.
80s.
I want to
80s.
know what you think a Apple video game console, for better or for worse, would look like. A successful Apple video game console would
This
look
is
like.
a fun little discussion.
Let's call it the iConsole. Maybe the Icon. Whoa.
What if it was the Apple? And instead of it being a computer, it was
like
a
an
console?
Apple console? I mean, that too.
Instead of the first...
But I'm not saying the first iteration of it. I'm talking about like what would the modern iteration of an Apple console look like?
You mean today?
Today, yeah.
Oh, so you're saying that we planted the seed.
We planted the seed, and
now
then we came back, and now it's grown to
50
fruition.
years
and
later.
now there is no Xbox.
Good grief. The 70s are almost 50 years ago.
I know, isn't that crazy? Yeah.
Wow.
1970.
That's a break.
Yeah, in
Okay,
December.
40-some years ago as of now. Because 2019. 1970 was 41 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh, geez. Anyway, I can't do math.
Right, so it's exploded. So, I don't know, maybe they knocked,
41.
maybe Xbox still exists, but the big players right now are like Sony, Nintendo, and Apple.
Now Apple's involved.
Yeah.
Oh, my.
What does their console look like? How does it compete? I'm thinking they probably made the touchscreen thing happen, in the
They would have, instead of spending so much effort on iPhones or iPods being touchy, they would have...
Or they would have integrated that somehow and made it...
They would have been focused on their console so much that it would be more gaming-centric. So would they have come out with a touchscreen? Still, probably. But Apple focuses so much on user interaction and how smooth it is. And like a lot of people say, if you don't know anything about computers, get an Apple because you can use it.
Yeah.
Because it's that that level of abstraction away from all of the lower level computer stuff. So I wonder, like the early consoles, they would be a direct competitor to Nintendo. Because
you think, yeah.
The Nintendo marketed themselves as a toy company to get into the hands of retailers, which we'll talk about later in the 70s. And I mean, Nintendo came out in the 80s, but the reason why they did that was set in the 70s.
Yeah.
We'll get there. So Apple would have been courting retailers and trying to get their stuff in their hands, and like, who knows, man? This would be...
I know, there's a lot of hypotheticals.
Like,
the things
Apple,
that come to mind...
Disney, and Nintendo are all very analogous in their own industries.
Right, but they keep themselves...
Well, they're all in different industries.
Right, yeah.
It's games, movies, TV, and cell phones.
And though they've each made attempts in some ways at the others, except maybe Nintendo. Nintendo's kind of stuck with games, but they've... Disney kind of tried to get into games, and Apple has... I think Apple's tried in some way, shape, or form to get into games. And Apple's tried to get into movies, too, but they've all... I don't know. The thing that comes to mind, though, when I think of Apple stuff is I don't know what it would be. I don't know what the 2019 quote unquote console would look like.
Yeah.
But I do think that somewhere in the aughts, they would have had some kind of thing where it was like they only make first party games and no third party games.
That would have been true for them. And this is where like,
because that was kind of like their
Nintendo.
thing. Yeah, that's kind of their thing. Yeah.
Because Nintendo, like, they were super, super strict about what could publish on their console, where so much so, if you go back to our 80s episode, we talk a little bit more in depth about this, but Nintendo had control over even the cartridges and the circuit boards.
Yeah.
And so in order to make a game for Nintendo, you had to buy all of your cartridges from Nintendo and your circuit boards, and then make your chip, your ROM, and attach it to their stuff.
I can definitely see...
Super proprietary and super, controlled. So Apple would totally be doing that, and they might not even have third party for a long time. They might just make their own stuff in-house.
I can see Apple really having, if they had gone down that road, they really could have been like the Nintendo of America,
right?
for better or for worse.
Yeah.
But the way that they kind of handle their business side of things, I wonder if they would have been as like successful, because a lot of what Nintendo is shaped by sort of a lot of that Japanese culture. And for better, I mean that by like, yeah, they kind of got proprietary in the 90s and kind of, but they also like, they knew how to run a business to make themselves look good.
Yep.
And also make themselves look humble.
Right.
Whereas Apple has a reputation for being, Steve Jobs specifically has a reputation for being a little bit big for his britches. So yeah, I have no idea how they would have
what would
fared.
Like a super user-friendly, what's the opposite of humble? Arrogant?
Arrogant, yeah.
Arrogant, in-your-face home video game console look like?
It would have been, that's kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But, yeah. So tell us what you think. Like an Apple, what would the I'm just gonna call it the Icon, because that's just like the perfect name, and I only imagine
cool.
I'm getting like, I must be getting brainwaves from some like parallel universe where that has actually happened. So the Icon, what would the Icon 7?
So what you're saying is there'd be some sort of like multiverse universe that you and I are having this very discussion, wondering what Nintendo could have done if they'd have come out with a home video game console instead of a cell phone.
At this moment, there is a parallel conversation happening that is the opposite of the one we're having now. It's amazing. It's probably called like negative 80-bit Podsmash.
It's the upside down.
Yeah, exactly. They're the upside down.
Speaking of which, you asked about Back to the Future when it was released, and the Stranger Things season 3 was set in 85, and that's when the release of Back to the Future was.
So. Yeah, okay, so that's way later than what we're talking about.
Yep.
Too bad.
Just had to throw that in there.
All right, cool. Well, if you haven't guessed by now, we are done with DLC. And we are going to be talking about the 70s. This is going to be one of three, I guess, technically, final episodes in our series about gaming by the decades. So we did the 90s, we did the aughts, and now we're like reversing.
Didn't we do the 80s?
No, we haven't done the 80s yet.
But then
although
I lied
we have
to our
talked
audience.
a lot. We have talked a lot about the 80s.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like it's almost, I don't know. We'll still do the 80s.
So yeah, we have to. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah,
excited about the 80s.
We still do the 70s, we'll do the 80s, and then on the probably our New Year episode, we can do a gaming by the decades for the 2010s, because it will no longer be the 2010s anymore.
It'll be a celebratory.
Yep. We can
2010 through 2019.
That'll wrap it up. So by the end of the year, we'll have wrapped up this series, and that's nice. That's nice to kind of think about wrapping up a series.
Put that in a bow.
Yeah, put the nice little tiny bow on it. So yeah, we'll talk about the 70s tonight. And it should be interesting, because
we're going to
70s are an
preface
interesting
this
time.
conversation.
I mean,
this conversation with, we could what?
I mean, technically, like, there were games if we talked about our history of video games, there were games that happened in like the late 50s.
Yeah, all the way back then.
But we're not, there wasn't a business around video games at that time.
Right.
So.
They were just done in labs, like one-offs.
Yeah.
So I want to preface this entire topic off of the fact that you and I have had zero experience with gaming in the 70s.
Exactly.
Maybe we
have
dabbled
no experience with
like Pong and Atari, some sort of recreation of those consoles in some iteration, but we have no connection to the 70s.
Right, yeah. I've played games from the 70s, but I was not born until 89. I barely have a connection to the 80s.
Right.
So...
I was born in 86.
Yeah, exactly. So we are not speaking from experience here. So if we get things wrong...
I try to
from the
be
70s.
as most accurate as I can with research and resources and things that I have.
Yeah, but same. But
with no experience.
If we get things wrong, just know that we are coming from a place of relative ignorance, being babies of the 80s.
Yep.
And really 90s kids,
yeah.
if anything. So yes, forgive us for that, and feel free to correct us, all of you. Is it mean to call them old timers? All you 70s babies out there, 70s kids. Please let us know if we get details wrong.
That'd be awesome. I'd love to have somebody on the show to talk about
really awesome,
a giant like retro conversation about the 70s and what gaming looked like back then. I would just
we
sit back
have
and
done
listen.
this episode with a guest, but oh well, that's fine.
We don't even know if there's a fan of our
2020.
show that's
true. Yeah.
old enough to be qualified.
Yeah.
So
I can probably think of someone. Someone's out there.
Yeah.
We'll see. Anyways, whatever. We're going to talk about the 70s now. Woo! So, yeah. So we kind of framed these gaming by the decades. We've broken up into three main, instead of like questions, we more or less framed them in kind of three main
subtopics.
Points. Yeah, subtopics. So we talk about what the culture was like in the 70s that contributed to video games. We talk about the landscape. By that we mean what kind of defined the decade.
Consoles and games wise.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, video games wise.
Yeah.
And then we talk about what the business was like. So how did the business of video games operate in the 70s? And boy, what a world.
Very different.
So different from what the video game industry is now. It's so fascinating to see how that's evolved over time. So I love that particular question. But anyways, so we're going to start off by talking about the culture what was the 70s? Like, what was 1970 through 1979?
I have some
Like-
high level, like, high level, like, non backed up knowledge.
Okay, yeah. That's
As represented by, like, media.
right.
And so I'm probably going to misspeak like crazy,
Yeah,
but
that's cool.
we had an era where the Vietnam War was done. The civil rights movement has happened.
Well, it was the Vietnam War was, I think they were backing off it. There was a whole thing about Saigon, and Nixon like lied about. He was like, "Oh yeah, totally removing troops from Vietnam," and then like
and didn't,
actually,
and that was the early 70s, I
that was in
assume.
the 70s, yeah, early 70s,
Wow.
I think, yeah.
See, I didn't even know about that.
That's what the whole Saigon thing was, and then we had then the public like forced him out or whatever. So maybe it was like we were just leaving. I don't know. Again, details. I listened to a primer today on like things that happened in the 70s, like important events, and that was one of them. But so it made me just think like, oh, was Vietnam still going on? In some level, or at least some presence in Asia we had. So
Interesting.
yeah.
So there was
military.
maybe some inherent racism by
yeah, totally.
post World War II through the civil rights movement now into Vietnam.
Yeah, civil rights
happening.
movement was like still going on too, but with the civil rights movement, the 70s, then it evolved into like a bunch of other movements.
Yes.
So things like the environmental movement started in the 70s, which is interesting. I hadn't realized that, but like Earth Day, Earth Day was established then. And that was partially sparked by there was an energy crisis in the 70s.
Oh, there was.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
my
there was like
parents told
some
me about
really
that.
important things
Yeah.
that were happening, but not just
A lot of revolution, a lot of freedom revolutions in different categories. And I
and
say
like
that
carrying that on from the 60s. It was definitely like and there was a lot of like anti-authority because again, we had been disillusioned
that's
by
why revolution.
Vietnam.
Anti-authority.
Yeah, that's fair. We had been and then also Nixon being the president, which of course would culminate with Watergate and his resignation, first president to resign in shame, if you will, from the presidency. So, so there was some big stuff that was happening, like politically. And then culturally, you had like, it was like the peak of disco with like the Bee Gees, as I hinted at with that, and
Barry Gibb talk show.
No time to talk. Solid bass line with like high vocals. That was like disco to a T. So all of that fashion and stuff that came around,
Bell bottoms and bright
also like rock started.
Yeah, Led Zeppelin.
Hard rock.
It was the rebellion of music, like the classics, or like the typical. Like I look at the Beatles, for example, right? 1950s.
And the Beatles, they broke up at the beginning
which
of the 70s.
is nuts to think about. John Lennon was like a cultural figure,
right?
But in the 1950s, the Beatles, right? They were rock, and they
rock
were
and roll.
They were like
the official, the quote unquote quintessential rock and roll, I guess, post Elvis.
And
rock
they
and
were
roll.
like countercultural, like crazy.
Right.
Parents of kids in the 50s who loved the Beatles. Parents were like, I can't believe you listen to that,
the
right?
Beatles.
Yeah, and if you look at the Beatles versus like Zeppelin. Crazy night and day,
right?
The introduction of like the electric guitar and like crazy rebellious loud rock and roll, like
right,
we love
hard
it.
rock. I guess
hard
was that
rock,
that was the beginning of then what would become metal, and then like hair metal in the 80s,
right? Yeah,
and all that stuff. So it was really a transitional time between like. But then, disco came out of nowhere. Disco in the late 60s then came out of nowhere, had its heyday in the 70s, and was completely apart from that rock and roll evolution.
Funk in the 60s.
Oh, yeah, and jazz. I guess that probably came out of jazz.
Was in the 60s, and jazz.
Jazz was older, but the progression, Which is, and that's just to say that's kind of always how music has evolved, is there's been these, at the same time as you had, grunge metal in the 90s, you also had the emergence of rap and then rap led into hip hop, and then grunge led into death metal, you know what I mean?
So they all evolved from each other,
parallel.
And their original ones persist as
and
well,
separate too, with some crossover. But so I guess that's just kind of how music always been.
We try to stay a family friendly podcast, so if you have children, maybe guard your ears. But there was also a sexual revolution, a sexual freedom
that started
revolution.
In the 60s.
It did,
but it did culminate
continued
with a lot of women's issues in the 70s.
Right.
Roe vs. Wade was in the end of the 70s, or near the middle of the 70s.
So birth control and or lack thereof, and kind of this is a very cultural movement about being free with your body and not being constrained to the cultural ideas of marriage, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Whether you agree with them or not, those things were issues
happening.
in the 70s. So sorry if you parents have to now talk to your kids about
but we're
these
talking
things,
about as neutral as possible. Those were the movements that were happening in the 70s.
Lots of revolutions, lots of bucking authority and doing your own thing and freedom in America.
Right, yeah.
But what I don't know anything about the 70s is what was the economic situation?
Oh, it was all over the place because there was an energy crisis. So it was kind of all over the
Right.
place. Yeah. And then, I don't know much about it either, but I do know that with the energy crisis, it was, and it was post No, it was what sparked, because the energy crisis was what sparked the movement towards nuclear power, which would then be kind of a big deal in the 80s with Chernobyl and 5 Mile Isle and stuff like that.
And when was the Cold War? It was late 60s, right?
The Cold War started technically right after World War One.
Oh.
Sorry, World War Two. My bad.
Okay.
World War Two, because that was when tension with Russia was the highest. So the Cold War lasted for about like 30 years.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. That's kind of the hinge.
Yeah.
Like that's the
I'm trying to remember when that was.
thumbprick on the whole entire Cold War. It was when there was a barricade around Cuba.
Well, and then Chernobyl started the decline of the Soviet Union, which then culminated in 89. So the 80s was kind of like the peak of Cold War tensions, because everyone thought the world was going to end.
In the 80s?
In the 70s and the 80s,
Wow.
I guess. Yeah, so that was like
Yeah, because that movie Red Dawn, remember that?
Yeah.
Anyway, we're digressing. Let's talk about, like, let's bring our 70s conversation into computing and video games.
And culture. Yeah. So the two biggest things that came out of the 70s that would have influence on the future of video games aren't necessarily related to video games themselves, though there was a lot of stuff that was happening with video games, of course, that we'll get to. But the two biggest things I think that would ultimately culturally shape the video games that came in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. The big one was movies. We had Jaws, we had Godfather, and then the big one, we had Star Wars happen in the 70s.
That was like 79 though, wasn't it?
It was, but,
Very
or 70, no, I think it was a little bit earlier than that. It was the late 70s for sure.
We
but
call ourselves nerds.
I know, we don't
even know.
Sorry, we don't
when
memorize
A New Hope.
dates. Okay.
I know about video games. Mario was 1985.
Jaws was important.
1996.
Jaws and Godfather were important because they were kind of, some people point back at them and say they were the first blockbusters, especially Jaws.
May
Jaws
25th,
was the first.
1977.
I was going to say 77, but
I had that in the back of my head too, and I
so
don't know
was
why.
79 Empire Strikes Back?
Let's see. And it was not immediate like I hoped Google would do. And now I'm on a Wikipedia page about Star Wars, and I'm scrolling through, and is this just A New Hope?
All right, we're moving on.
Yep,
We're moving on.
Whatever.
So, Jaws is widely considered to be the first summer blockbuster, because it was a big summer movie. Usually movies didn't come out in
Empire
the summer
Strikes
at the
Back was
time.
1980. Sorry.
Okay, you're done. I'm going to cut all this and just say Jaws is widely considered to be the first.
It's Jaws.
It's Jaws.
It's Jaws.
And it was the first blockbuster from Steven Spielberg, because at that time movies weren't really released in the summer, and so it was the first one that was like a big summer flick that drew in big crowds,
Which
made
made
a ton of money.
sense. It's a shark movie. People were at the beach.
Of course, yeah. You wanted to scare people when they were at the beach.
Yeah.
But even though Jaws kind of started the idea of a blockbuster, it was Star Wars that kind of started the idea of like a serialized franchise that was playing on what are things, because Jaws is approachable by anybody. Jaws is totally targeting like, normal middle class people who like to go to the beach and stuff like that, whereas Star Wars was targeting the nerds at the time.
Yeah,
was
sci-fi
targeting the
and
dorks.
stuff.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. Being a sci-fi kind of weird space fantasy. But yeah, I would really it really was arguably like one of the first major like franchises the way we know them now, like entertainment franchises. And just considering the fact that there's way more Star Wars games than there are Jaws games or Godfather games. Just the fact that Star Wars, started.
A lot of John
70s.
Williams movies, though.
Yeah, that's true. And then the other big thing that happened in the 70s was, like I said earlier, the emergence of Microsoft and Apple, which of course not only would be hugely influential to PC gaming, but also, of course, Microsoft would go on to make the Xbox, so it was the start of their thing. And then Apple's revolutions to computing in general have had huge impacts on the gaming industry.
Right. And they all founded themselves in the 70s.
Yep.
In their garages.
Exactly, yep.
So we have like the advent of the personal computer.
So it really was. I mean, I would say that the video game business, though video games existed and had foundations as early as the late 50s, the business started.
Yep.
And
we'll get there.
It's born. Its origin is the 70s. Yeah. So we'll get there.
Episode. Yep.
All right, cool. Let's talk. Are you ready to talk about landscape then?
Let's
Did you
do
have
it.
anything else you want to talk
That's
about?
it.
All right, landscape. What were the consoles and games that solidified and defined the decade?
Most of gaming in the 70s took place in the arcade. The idea of having a home console plugged into your TV was
Too expansive.
It was expensive. It was like middle class and upper middle class mostly. They cost $100 at the time. I'm going to start with the Magnavox Odyssey came out in 1972. It was the first ever home console. Its most notable contribution to gaming was a tennis game that inspired Pong.
Interesting.
So much so that there was a giant lawsuit between Magnavox and Atari that lasted all the way into the 80s.
How dare your identical white square look like my identical white square?
Right.
making a square go
Can
back.
you imagine that lawsuit? Like, I'm gonna put a copyright on tennis. Like, seriously,
Yeah, for real.
I don't know. I don't even want to know. I did not dig into what that meant or who won or what the results are. But apparently, it lasted into the
happened,
80s,
yeah,
and there
wow.
was tons of millions of dollars spent on lawyers and litigation and all that stuff. But anyway, so Magnavox came out with the Odyssey, like I said, 1972. This console worked with using static cling screen overlays. That's hard to say. Static cling screen overlays instead of rendered graphics. So the graphics were so primitive. They were just white blocks on a black background that you had to put something on your TV to give it the color background that you needed to play games. It also came with playing cards, dice, poker chips in the box to give you more types of games to play. I don't even know. Like, I've never seen this in my life.
You need one, though.
I do.
You
I
just
really
genuinely
do.
needed an
I need
Magnavox
one.
Odyssey.
So if anyone's got
Anyone
a
wants
Magnavox,
to donate it,
yeah, I would love one. That would be amazing. But apparently there's a lot of physical things happening with the playing cards and poker chips and dice, and you can play casino games and stuff, and it would display things on the screen as well. I don't really know a whole lot about it, but 1972 was so long ago.
That's so crazy.
That was the first one. Then later on, after that, the success of Pong and the tennis games thereof spawned a line of dedicated Pong consoles. So these were single game consoles that you just plug in and it's Pong or some variation of it. So Sears came out with the Telegames, which is Sears Telegames, and then the Coleco Telstar, not to be confused with the ColecoVision that came out in the 80s.
Yep.
But that was foundational. So Coleco kind of put itself out there
for
for the first time with its Pong clone or Pong console.
Dedicated Pong console.
This is so hard to talk. Pong console clone.
Yeah. Wow.
Jeez. No, I still said it wrong. Pong clone console. It is a console that plays a Pong clone.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I see. Yeah.
Dumb. I'm moving on.
Dumb,
all right. So
dumb.
of course Atari. Bushnell. I remember his last name, but his first name is Nolan. Nolan Bushnell. I think it is.
I don't know.
Started Atari in the
okay.
70s. And mostly with arcade games, of course, with the actual Pong, the one that everyone remembers. But in 1977, the Atari 2600 came out, kicking off Generation 2 home consoles. And then Magnavox Odyssey closed out the 70s major console line in 1978 with their Odyssey 2.
Nice. So, wow. This is crazy to think.
That's it.
Like Magnavox versus Atari was the first console war.
Right. Right.
This is crazy.
Yeah. And the reason why Atari spawned Gen 2 is because they started with the 8-bit chips. Like that was
the beginning of the 8-bit.
Yeah. The arcades at the time. So most of the gaming in the 70s was done in the arcades. You had Space Invaders, you had Galaxian, you had Breakout.
Right. Which we did a whole episode on arcades, but for a reminder, an arcade game, to differentiate from a console game, or console, is it's a box that has a single game in it.
Right.
And it has usually, it's huge, takes a lot of electricity, and has some kind of, can have physical attachments that serve as controllers.
Right.
Yeah.
To get a little bit lower level and a little bit nerdier.
Yeah, sure.
More modern computers today have what's called a microprocessor. And you can run a multitude of programs on that same processor.
Yeah.
A calculator versus Doom, right? Like you can run both on the same hardware, correct? In the 70s, arcades, the circuits themselves were hardwired to be a game. So you couldn't have a calculator and Pong run on the same hardware.
Right,
It was literally made on the metal, like connected circuits to make a game. So that's arcades in the 70s.
But they were so rudimentary that now, I'm pretty sure, I don't know if this is for sure, so I might be talking out of my butt right now, but I'm pretty sure people have taken the basic programming of arcade games and recreated them in Minecraft.
Oh,
they've made processors in Minecraft to make Pong, for example.
They've done
crazy.
that.
Yeah. It's nuts.
You can do that.
So rudimentary. Yeah.
It's all just like transistors and electrical circuits. It's once you learn about it, it's like way simpler than you think. Yeah, it's awesome. So that's pretty much like home consoles. Now, notable game franchises from the 70s include, I have a small list here, Oregon Trail.
Yep.
Space Invaders. I know.
Oregon Trail's Invaders,
awesome.
classic.
Space Invaders, yeah. Pong, Asteroid, Breakout, Lunar.
Breakout. I want to talk about Breakout for a second.
Yeah.
That was the one that was designed by Steve Wozniak. Or, Steve Wozniak? Not Steve Jobs. Whatever, Wozniak, the partner to...
That's Microsoft. Well, Bill Gates' dude.
Woz?
I thought so.
I'm pretty sure I thought it was Jobs and Woz who started Apple.
Really?
Yeah. I'm pretty sure about that. But anyways, he designed Breakout before, and it served as... And that's the reason I say is because it served as the inspiration for the Apple computer.
What?
Yeah. Anyways, I played the crap out of Breakout.
Breakout's awesome. That's where you have the ball that bounces.
At the bottom. It's like Pong against bricks.
Breakout was made by Atari. Nolan Bushnell, Steve Bristow, and Steve Wozniak.
Steve Wozniak. Okay,
so Steve Wozniak was a designer with Nolan Bushnell for Atari.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So, but it went on to inspire the Apple computer.
Was the basis and inspiration for certain aspects of the Apple II personal computer.
Yeah.
So you're correct.
Nuts.
There you go.
Yeah. Anyways, Breakout. It's a great game. I like. It's so rudimentary, but I played a lot of it as a kid.
Yep. It had the layer of bricks at the top, and you bounce the ball off the bottom. It was a really fun version of that when you get like power-ups and stuff later on that was more 16-bit stuff. But, okay, so Lunar Lander. Mm-hmm. Everyone's played that. Yeah. Right? I assume.
Was that the one that had vector graphics? Yeah. And inspired Asteroid?
Maybe Raster. That's the thing I wanted to talk about.
Yeah. We'll talk about that. Yeah, we'll get to it.
Yeah. And then Galaxian, Space Wars. Space Wars was really early. And then Pac-Man. Mm-hmm. So Namco was on the scene as a publisher. Yep. Taito was on the scene as a publisher. Taito made Space Invaders. And you had Atari.
Was Galaxian the first one I think Galaxian was the first one that brought in color.
I don't know. But Galaga's its sequel.
Right, yeah.
And Galaga's.
Galaga.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Mm-hmm. Pac-Man I thought Pac-Man came in the 80s.
It was... I read that it was in the 70s.
You're probably right.
Mm-hmm. It came out on Atari. Yeah. There was an Atari version for it.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, yeah, that's that. Did you want to talk about... Is here probably a good time to talk about then the vector versus raster?
Yeah, and I was trying to do some research on that because I don't remember which one's which, but I think vector graphics are the ones that required. They looked a lot sharper. They were really good looking. Yeah, and Asteroid is one of the biggest.
Yeah, it's kind of the definitive vector graphic game because even though there were games that were experimenting with it before,
it's
Asteroid
vector.
was the one that kind of
I was correct.
it.
So vector required like an entirely different monitor, it's specialized hardware to even run. But if you look, Lunar Lander was also a vector graphics game. You can tell. I played at the Barcade, at Circuit Barcade.
Yeah,
a version of Defender, I believe, had vector graphics.
Interesting, yeah.
And it just looks sharper, super, super bright, high contrast. It was revolutionary.
Yeah.
But there's no way you could get that to run at home because you needed a specialized TV, and TVs were not for vector graphics.
Right.
It's
and
hard
TVs themselves were not cheap either.
Right.
You know, a TV, you have to have a TV, a home console, and these are things we take for granted now. Like, oh yeah, they're expensive, but they're affordable. They were not in the 70s. They were definitely the top end of luxury items to have. And again, hence why gaming kind of really found its roots in arcades. So we'll get to that one.
Defender was made in the 80s, so that's irrelevant to us. But it drew inspiration from Space Invaders and Asteroids, which were both 70s.
The kind of innovations that came out of this decade, you know, they may not seem like big leaps from, you know, people who grew up in the 90s and the 2000s, but they really were. I mean, they were in their own way. You know, we went from games that could only be black and white in the beginning of the 70s, and they started experimenting with color, and they started experimenting with different graphic types, and started experimenting with the foundations of what games would be. I mean, there were sports games, there were racing games that came out. I was listening to a YouTube video that was describing some of the more influential games of the 70s, and one of the ones they brought up was Night Race?
Yeah.
No. Well, Night Drive or whatever.
Speed Race?
There was also, it wasn't that one, Death Race too. Death Race. There's a game called Death Race.
Yeah, we talked about that. Night Driver?
Where you run over. There was Night Driver, then there was Death Race, and Death Race
is 77 by Exidy.
Yeah. So, but the Death Race was you ran over gremlins. Well, there were gremlins in the game, but you're running over people. Anyways, what was notable was people in the 70s, parents and adults in the 70s were concerned about the psychological effect that would have on children playing that game. And it's just kind of funny that it's like literally there's squares on a screen and parents still freaked out over squares on a screen when like Mortal Kombat in the 90s.
We talked about that. Yeah, Grand Theft Auto in the early aughts.
It's never going away. Nope. This idea that like video games are going to corrupt our youth and are going to make them hyper violent literally goes as far back as squares running over other squares on a screen in an arcade with Death Race. So I just thought that was notable. But yeah. I mean, you just saw like all these, like, again, they were smaller, much smaller scale leaps by today's standards, but there was a huge amount of experimentation in video game types that would then go on to inform the types of video games that we have now.
Yep.
You know, throughout the 80s, 90s, and aughts.
And the microprocessor came out in the 70s as well. The first arcade video game to use the microprocessor was Midway's Gunfight.
Midway.
Yeah, so Midway, Williams, Bally. There's all these like arcade publishers that were relevant. Sega was there with Motocross.
Yep.
Haptic feedback was the first handlebars to vibrate during collisions. And then Atari came out with Night Driver and Breakout. XD with Death Race. So arcades were nuts in the 70s. Those are early
Cool.
70s.
Well,
And
why don't we
later
segue
on,
to that and talk about then we'll use that as
the
our
business
launching off
side.
point to talk about what did the business look like? What was the video game business like in the 70s?
So, like I said, it's mostly arcades. So there was a ton of competition for each other in the arcades. That was kind of where most of the money came from. But in the home console front, we had Atari coming out as the big first party. I mean, we talk about Magnavox. They didn't really last long enough to be considered a long first party.
And it was such a clunky, all things considered, it was such a clunky console that, like, I would argue that the first console that really, like, mattered in regards to, like, this was the first console that would prototype what consoles would be like.
Yeah.
In the next coming decades was the Atari.
Yeah, the 2600.
Yep.
It had
The Atari
cartridges
2600,
and controllers, multiplayer.
Right.
You didn't
have to have a bunch of other stuff to put on the
Screen
screen.
overlays,
right.
yeah.
You plugged it in, you put a game in, you hooked up a controller, and you went to town.
Yeah.
Yep.
And this is where I can talk about toys in a minute and retailers. Activision was first established, the first ever third-party publisher to come out with games in the arcade and on home consoles across the board on different stuff. You'd see Activision games coming out as a publisher.
Yeah.
And then, like I said, with retailers. So, like, there were specific consoles from the retailers. They were that married together. And that's something I want to highlight that's so different today. Like, PlayStation came out with the PlayStation 4. You can buy it at Amazon, Walmart, Target, Toys R Us, Best Buy. Doesn't matter. You can buy it anywhere you want. It's still a Sony PlayStation.
Yeah.
But in the 70s, and even in the early 80s, and sometimes into the 90s,
Oh, really?
even, there were consoles that were like Sears' version of it.
No.
Yeah.
That's nuts.
Yeah.
Like the Walmart console.
Well, Walmart was different in and of
Right,
itself
right,
because
yeah.
they didn't come out till later, and at that point, Nintendo and
sure,
Sega...
but it's the equivalent of having like a Walmart console.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it would be like a flavor of a
Yeah.
console. So Sears had their Pong, like, clone console. Yeah.
Wow, that is so different.
Like how the business side of things, how the hardware developers courted the retailers to get their products into their stores and fight for that retail space. Remember, there's no internet. Catalogs were a thing, I guess. If you want to talk about ordering from a warehouse, you had to order through a magazine, like through a catalog. That was about the equivalent to internet shopping that we have in the 70s. And so what was in the stores was so much more valuable then than it is today. And so fighting for that shelf space mattered. Atari was king. So actually, like, so much king that there was a giant build up to 1983 was when the video game crash happened because there was so much video games that retailers couldn't move any product because they had so much of it.
Yeah.
And that's like Atari ended up shooting themselves in the foot later. But in the 70s, where we're highlighting and focusing now, they found success with just their Atari 2600, which retailers clamored for. So even Atari kind of bucked that trend early on.
Yeah,
because
they kind of definitely fought.
you could walk into a Sears and see a couple of Sears consoles, and then you see the
you
Atari.
yeah.
Right.
And which was the goods. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so it was definitely an interesting...
The whole idea of publishing, being a third-party publisher, was new in the 70s. It never happened. Now we have, like, Activision, EA, like a million of them. There's so many. Gearbox is a publisher. Bethesda... Like, they're all third-party publishers.
The 70s was such a wild
Ubisoft.
west for not just video gaming, but computing in general.
Yeah.
But, like, definitely with video games, it's just like, again, arcades, you had so many, that's why I say the business started in the 70s, because you had so many people all kind of, like, rising up and saying, like, let's make games.
And you talk about, that's actually a really good
games.
segue, because today we have the indie movement, and the indie developers are still looking to use the stores as a way to get their product out there.
Yeah,
so you still have to go through the eShop or the PlayStation Network or etc. Back then, people were making games on these computers, especially in Europe. It was crazy popular. Like one of the early Odysseys, one of the early computers had full keyboards and programming languages. You could make your own games.
Yeah.
People were printing games on discs and selling them in their like mom and pop store down the street in plastic bags with like a paper printed insert
Nice.
as to what these games were. And they were super indie, like super non-global, right?
Yeah.
It was like, oh, this
It's
store
just
over
local,
here,
yeah.
and this community's got this game, and if it was popular enough, maybe it would go through. And I mean, it was very, very grassroots and very Wild West, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, and then even arcades, as we talked about in our episode focusing on arcades, like, if you wanted to make money making a video game, you made it, you put it in a big old case, you sold that case for thousands of dollars to an arcade, and then the arcade would make money off of the quarters,
right?
Daily quarters. Just a completely different business model than the way we have it now.
Yeah.
Like, you sold a big expensive box,
Right.
and then
to a business.
Yeah, and then that's how you made your money.
Yeah.
I guess you probably licensed the game in some. There's probably some sort of licensing going on too, or you made some royalty money. But yeah, or maybe they leased them. I can imagine maybe they leased the arcade.
That's probably what it was.
Boxes out.
That makes sense because game design was centered around quarters and
Yeah.
eating your quarters.
Yeah.
So like they would actually design the game to make money through quarters.
Yeah.
So how would a publisher or developer make money if they just sold the box and called it quits?
Yeah, so they probably leased it.
That's what I'm guessing.
And the arcade was expected to pay a monthly or yearly fee
to have it there.
But then they got the money off the quarters.
Right.
The actual quarters.
They got a cut
through.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I imagine that the arcade probably like gets all the money from the quarters and then are just expected to play probably a flat monthly fee for whatever the game is. I don't know. Yeah, that would be interesting to
how to run an arcade.
Research.
Someone let us know.
How to run in the arcade in the 70s.
Right.
Yeah. Because now running an arcade is very different.
Right.
So, well, cool. Yeah. Any other things you wanted to highlight about the business of video games in the 70s?
I don't know enough.
Don't know enough. Exactly. Yeah. We weren't around. We're going to have a similar issue with the 80s, but we know a little bit more because... You know,
I have a rack of 80s games on my shelf.
I was going to say, the 80s,
my room.
We were young, we were old enough in the 90s to still have the spillover of enjoying games from the 80s, enjoying that culture from the 80s too. Yeah. So, so that's gaming by the decade. That's the 70s kind of in a nutshell. Yep. From two people who didn't even exist as apples in our parents' eyes when
Pun
the
intended
70s were happening. Because the Apple computer. We didn't. So we were not only we weren't around. I don't even know if my parents were married in the 70s. So yeah, that's crazy to think about. I didn't even exist. I didn't. Not only did I not exist, I just didn't exist. Not only I didn't exist, but I didn't exist. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I definitely would want to hear any thoughts from people who were around in the 70s. So if you were around in the 70s and have anything you wanted to add about what was influential and what games were important to you in the 70s, we definitely want to hear about it. Termite.
Go talk to your grandparents about what maybe if they were running around in the bars and the arcades and things, like maybe your grandparents have some memories of playing some arcades or even the arcade craze that was the 70s. As I said earlier in our episode, you can find us at 80bitpodsmash.com. That's our landing website where we have all the links to various podcast platforms as well as our social media platforms, Facebook, Reddit, Instagram, and Twitter at 80bitpodsmash.
Yeah.
That's it.
Is that it? So we'll see you next week.
See you next week.